the tabernacle, I can't have the ark around me, and then he finds out that the house that has it is blessed. So here's this interesting thing with God's presence. It brings death and it brings blessing, right? And it's like, I want it, but I don't want it because people die. All right? So in the temple, there are increasing levels of sanctity, of holiness, right? Of set-apartness. There's the outer court, there's the holy place, and then there's the Holy of Holies. So I just want to briefly mention an overview of the biblical, theology of presence. God dwells with mankind in the garden. And it is good, and they're called to bring God's rule and God's order to the garden, but man gets kicked out. So God says, build me a tent in the wilderness, and I'm going to come and dwell in your midst. I'm going to come live with you, and you're going to approach me. It's my desire that you approach me, but you have to do it in a particular way. And the glory fills the temple. You get later on to the time of Kings. Solomon builds the temple, the fixed temple of God's dwelling place. And in 1 Kings 8, the glory of God descends and dwells in that temple. Again, God is very persistent to say, I want to dwell with my people. I want to be in their midst. They have to understand what that means. When we get to the prophet Isaiah, among other things, he can say that God is Emmanuel, God with us, right? He desires to be with us. But most tragically, Ezekiel chapter 10 is when Ezekiel sees the image of God. By the way, in the beginning of Ezekiel, he sees God's chariot, right? He sees the animals that pull God's chariot and the wheels within wheels and those and all of that. And God, it's his ride, all right? And he sees God there in Persia. But then in chapter 10, he sees God's ride show up to the temple and God leaves, all right? So if you think about that, for example, we'll get to this later. In the time of Samuel, the ark leaves. And if you pay attention to that story, it's almost like the ark has a mind of its own, right? I mean, they think they're going to use the ark, and God says, I won't be treated that way, and he's gone. And he goes from city to city among the Philistines, and they all get the tumors and everything, and finally he goes back. It's very much like what we see in Ezekiel. God says, I will not dwell with you. I will not live with you. When you understand me and treat me this way, I'm gone. And his glory departs there in Ezekiel. And then, of course, John 1:14, John tells us that the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. And it's very important that the word he uses is tabernacle. It is the same word as the wilderness tent. All right? Jesus comes to dwell in the midst of his people. And then, with all kinds of imagery in the New Testament, Paul can say that you are the temple. And I'll just read one example of this. That the people of God, and by the way, he says this to the Corinthians. All right, he tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 3:16, do you not know that you are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. Think about the people that God killed in the Old Testament for disregarding his laws about the temple. And Paul is saying, you, the church, are God's temple. So what God does to you, what people may do to you to destroy God's temple, God will do to them. Does that make sense? Paul is, among other things, saying the people that are bringing division to the temple, well, that's what God thought of Uzzah, that's what he thinks of them. All right, and a good example of that is Ananias and Sapphira, I guess. Bam. And then Revelation 21:3. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. What started in the garden, it finally gets fulfilled, right? And the temple was a major stopping point along the way to God dwelling with his people. Some comments on God's ways as we see them through these books. First of all, he tests his people. And this is very important. We've already seen God test Abraham. We see God test his people in the wilderness to see what was in their heart. By the way, we talked about the heart this weekend. I didn't even mention this theme. But what God is doing, remember Jesus says it's not what comes into your body from outside that makes you unclean, but it's what comes out of your heart. And so God brings about circumstances that allow what's in his people's heart to come out, to show them what's there. I think to show them what's there so that he could then deal with it. I think God, again, he does that with us. He allows us to see what's in our heart so that he can then kill that thing, cut it away by the Spirit, so that we can be and live as he wants us to be and live. But testing is a major theme, and God tests his people. Now remember, the New Testament makes it clear God doesn't tempt his people. It's a different word. He doesn't tempt them to sin, but he allows temptation, and he allows testing, right? But he never allows testing without a way out. I think that's an important testimony of Scripture, is there is always a way out that God provides. I remember as a young Christian realizing if there's always a way out, if I sinned, I chose not to take the way out. And that's a very significant, sobering thing to think about. Suffering and trial of the wilderness. Again, I think there's a very strong parallel between Romans chapter 8 and the walk of the church and Christians today. If you look in Romans chapter 8, it is both victorious and, I don't want to say defeating, but there's suffering, right? Paul can say, listen, we are the children of God. We are led by the Spirit. We have his presence, and we're groaning, and we're waiting, and we're groaning with creation. And there's a lot of bad stuff that happens to us, but what we know is that because we are led by him, everything that happens to us, he uses for good. He uses to conform us to the image of his Son. So it's a good exercise to read Romans 8 with the wilderness in mind, right? With the wilderness and what God was doing in his people and letting happen. You can look at it as his love to try to lead them in Christ-likeness. All right. A comment about the covenants, real brief. So we mentioned Adam's covenant. Rule creation with me, Adam. We've mentioned Noah's covenant. I am committed to redeem creation and not wipe it out. I want you to rule with me. Same thing he said to Adam. Abraham's covenant. I'm going to use your family and your children to bless the world and fix what's wrong with the world. The covenant with Moses and Israel. I'm going to redeem creation as you imitate my character, as my presence dwells in your midst, and as you are a light for the nations. And again, I think that obviously those things are fulfilled in us. We are conformed to the character of Christ, and his presence is in us. And that is the significant thing that makes us different from the world. And Leviticus and all these other books call us to be living sacrifices, right? Living sacrifices, giving our life for the life of the world. All right, let me make some brief comments about the review of the contents of each of these books, and then that's going to be it for tonight. Okay, so as I said, Exodus. A couple of the highlights we've already mentioned. God gives his name. We see his character in context. Remember, some of these images, the crossing of the Red Sea is baptism. It's an image for, among other things, baptism, where it speaks of the baptism to come. I think I mentioned that in Luke, Jesus, when he is talking with Elijah, and I have a question, sorry. The Transfiguration? I've asked a lot of people this that don't know the answer to this question. John, James, and Peter are on the Mount of Transfiguration, and Moses and Elijah appear talking to Jesus. How do they know it's Moses and Elijah? Any thoughts? I mean, how do they know? I see two people, but how do they know it's Moses and Elijah? I really don't have an answer.
There's a YouTube video about them. So it's on YouTube. That's it.
I mean, does Moses have the Ten Commandments, maybe? Maybe Jesus says, "Hi, Moses, hi, Elijah." I don't know. All right, I don't remember why I mentioned that. So, Jesus is talking with Moses and Elijah about the exodus that he is about to undergo. The Greek word is exodus. It's precisely the same word. He is about to undergo the going out from sin and death that all the human race needs to undergo himself in his person. He's going to be driven out. He's going to go out and bring about a freedom from slavery to death. So again, all these images in Exodus. Leviticus. That title comes through the Latin, but the Hebrew the title in the Hebrew is the first line of it, and it's "and he called." And a lot of people say that there's more significance to that title than Leviticus, just the rules for the priests. And he called. He called to his people to bring offering to him. Right? He called to his people to bring offerings before him. Obviously, Leviticus deals with the sacrifices in the temple, but consider the nature of sacrifice. It ultimately, we find out in Jesus, is the giving of self for the life of another. And if you consider, if we go back to Abel, again, I think we mentioned that we don't know why God honored his sacrifice, but if you think about what Paul says about, if you give all that you have, but have not love, it doesn't matter, right? It counts for nothing. So something in Abel's sacrifice to God was a giving of himself to God for God's glory. And something in the giving of Cain was a farce, was a presentation, but there was a holding back of himself. Does that make sense? And so in sacrifice, it is what we give. It is what God called his people to give for the life, well, for God's glory, but for the life of the people of God. All right, so I think it's a good way to think about sacrifice. It is the giving of yourself for the life of others. Mother and father, they have children, they give themselves to the life of their children, to their benefit, to the next generation. That is the nature of all sacrifice.
So is there something with that as to why Ananias died?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Ananias gives something, but it's clear he's holding something back, right?
Because Peter says he could have kept some of the money, but it was more the heart.
Yeah, it was more, there was something in his giving that was calculating, there was something in his giving that was withholding from God. He wanted to give the pretense of sacrifice, but really withhold something in his heart. Absolutely. Real quick, let me give you some references to all these things in Leviticus, just off the top, things in Leviticus that are Christological. And again, if you read Hebrews, that's a good key to Leviticus. Hebrews talks a lot about Christ there and the sacrifices and everything else. So 1 Corinthians 5:7, cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump. I've always thought that was funny, be a new lump. That you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover Lamb, has been sacrificed. All right, so remember for Passover every year, and Jews still do this, they go through, think about it, you got to get rid of all the leaven. Think about what a cleaning job that is. They literally empty out all their cabinets, wash all their pots and pans, get rid of some that may have had contact with leaven to get rid of all the leaven. All right? So again, leaven is sin. But at any rate, the Passover lamb. Hebrews 9:15. Well, I always have a hard time finding Hebrews. All right, Hebrews 9:15. Therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant. Again, this is referring back to the covenant with Moses. So that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. Since A death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. All right, and he goes on to talk about the elaboration of the new covenant. Hebrews 13:11. This speaks of the scapegoat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside of the camp. So Jesus suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. So the scapegoat. The thank offering, Mark 14. All right, remember this is one of the many offerings there. Mark 14, 23. And as they were eating, he took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. So with the thank offering, or in reference to the thank offering, he offers communion. Mark 14:3. And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. This is a reference to the libation in Leviticus 2:1. All right, she is doing a priestly thing. By the way, it's a woman doing a priestly thing here. So she's doing a priestly thing and offering a libation to Jesus. Burnt offering. The burnt offering referred to in Leviticus 1 and 2:9, Ephesians 5:2. Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. All right? So loving one another, giving yourself, whatever it is of yourself, your time, your money, or your actual life, is a pleasing aroma, is a pleasing sacrifice to God, just as Christ did. Expiation. Leviticus 4 talks about expiation. And in Romans 3:25, Paul says, "You are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, who God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith." So propitiation or expiation. And then one last one, first fruits. Remember the first fruits offering in Mark 10. Back to Mark again. Mark 10 and 45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. I don't think that's the first fruits. That may be redemption. I may have got my reference messed up there. Anyway, those are just, again, hopefully the more you read Leviticus and the more you read the New Testament, the more you pick up these references to things in the Old Testament, right? Who is it that talks about Christ as the first fruits from among the dead? All right, that's one of the, that's a reference to his resurrection. I think that's in Romans at the end, 15. All right, briefly, Numbers. As I said, Numbers covers this time after the law is given and they leave Sinai and they're approaching the promised land. And along the way, there's 7 tests and 7 failures of Israel, and God dealing with that generation and preparing the next generation to take them into the promised land. And among other things, I think Numbers can teach us both the high calling of God's people and a humility and an honesty in dealing with where the people really are and what God sometimes needs to do to get them ready to go and carry out their calling. I think, again, it cultivates hope. We have a very important high calling, and it cultivates humility in dealing with where we might really be and where God needs to get us. And then finally, Deuteronomy. Again, the Hebrew title for Deuteronomy means more or less repetition. Paul said, "I don't mind saying this to you again. I don't mind repeating myself," and Moses repeated himself. It is a repetition of what God has done, where God has led them, And it is, ultimately, he sets up the people on the two mountains, and he says, I set before you today life and death, blessing and cursing. It's very important because there's this fancy word theologians use, Deuteronomic, I think I spelled that right, where the prophets constantly refer back to what Moses said in Deuteronomy. He said, I'm setting before you life and death. You choose this path, here's what will happen. If you go after idols, if you become like the nations around you, I will send those nations to take you captive and drive you out of the land. All right? So it is, I hate to say it this way, and it's not quite as crass as this, but it is the I told you so. Right? It is God saying, here's what I'm going to do. I'm calling you to walk this way. I'm setting before you these options, but here's what I'm going to do if you don't live according to those options. Right? So Deuteronomy really sets up the following books, and again, especially the prophets. They will refer back to these things that Moses said. All right, so there's a rip-roaring survey. What kind of thoughts or questions from your reading? And by the way, I gave everybody the new schedule.
Can I have an extra one for the
Yes.
Well, and Grace.
Yes. So, reading this week Deuteronomy, I guess that's a good way to summarize what we've covered. Again, he's going to go back over a lot of what happened in the 42 years after they left the wilderness. By the way, it's 42 years, right? From leaving Egypt to entering the promised land, really. And then next week we'll get into Joshua. So, what kind of questions, thoughts from this material?